Okay, I want to speak a little bit about the Eric Garner case. I already made a video about this, but it's only going to be a matter of time before something else similar happens. So this is always relevant. I spoke in that video about how outraged I was by the decision of the grand jury not to indict the officer responsible for killing Eric Garner. If you're not familiar with the case, this was basically a black man in, I think it was in Staten Island, was killed by the NYPD. An officer put him in a chokehold. The man had asthma and he died on the spot. It was a very graphic video. It's probably circulating less now because the family requested that they didn't want that, which is understandable, and I'm going to respect their request and not put any links to that. But this of course set off large-scale protests against police brutality, and yet another example of police abusing their authority. Now, there's a few things I think are important to recognise. Firstly, it is important to look at individual cases, because whilst there is a generic problem, no two cases are exactly alike, so it is important to judge these situations individually. Although there is a generic problem, and it's also, I think it's entirely legitimate to be concerned about that, but I'm sceptical about people automatically comparing it to other cases, so I do think this is different from the Ferguson case. This case is a lot more clear cut to me that it was absolutely wrong what happened to this man, and it is absolutely wrong that the grand jury failed to indict the officer responsible. Now, I've just watched a bit of the speech by Mayor Bill de Blasio, and I'm pleased to say he's come out quite strongly against the indictment, and he suspects it was based on racism. Based on what I know from this case, I cannot help but think it would be anything else. Because if you see the video, the original video, if you've seen that, there's absolutely no rational excuse for what that officer done. Nothing. What I want to talk a little bit about in this is the police culture that defends this, and also other American citizens who defend it, and therefore with those attitudes allow this problem to continue. Now, it's my understanding that since this indictment, or lack of indictment, there has been a number of NYPD officers taking online to defend Officer Pantaleo. And their logic basically is that New Yorkers are ungrateful. Now, this is something the police often do, and not just the NYPD, other police forces, when they are basically scrutinised over these sort of cases. They sort of take this attitude, well, we risk our lives to defend the public. The public should be grateful. But the problem is they've got to a situation whereby they believe they're like Robocop, they could do whatever they want. So if the public dare protest or dare raise questions about their behaviour, then they just use this card of, oh well, you're being ungrateful. Now, a few things I want to say about that. It is true that being a police officer is a dangerous job. It is true that officers have been killed in the line of duty, and it is true that there are probably many examples of officers performing heroics and protecting people from violent gangs and so on. It's also true that they do work every day that most of us can't imagine. They have to deal with murder cases, they have to deal with violent criminals. So yes, it is a very difficult job, and yes, they probably do a lot of good work in protecting the public. However, that does not excuse abusing their position. They chose to be officers. They chose that. And their motto, from what I gather, is protect and serve. Serve. Not be above criticism. Not act like Robocop. And those officers who are defending Officer Pantaleo don't seem to realise why so much of the public is angry. And by the way, it's not just the African American community. There have been many Asian Americans and white Americans joining those protests because they recognise this is a general problem. And from a European perspective, although, believe me, our police are not much better, there is a trend in this direction as well, although I don't think quite as bad as their American counterparts at this point, but when you have officers basically killing a man in broad daylight, and I regard this as a killing, nothing short, and when that officer is basically let off the hook, that is basically the epitome of a police state. Now, there were people criticising de Blasio, saying, oh well, he relies on the police, why is he complaining? Like, he relies on the police, he has a police protection team. As mayor of New York City, he is absolutely within his rights to comment on this case and to reflect the concerns of his constituents. In fact, I would say that it would be very unprofessional of him if he wasn't to say anything. So it is absolutely right that he speaks out about this. And frankly, I think he's doing more than either Bloomberg or Giuliani did. Politicians only have a certain amount of power, but I do think that there needs to be change in legislation would be good that absolutely makes it crystal clear that officers are not above the law. Because at the moment there is a situation in America whereby the police basically think that they are above the law. And if that isn't the case, then I don't know how else explains this attitude they have. Another problem that exists here is that too many other Americans are prepared to make excuses for them. I've seen a lot of comments online basically blaming the victim and saying that oh well, if he wasn't selling unlicensed cigarettes this wouldn't have happened. He was resisting arrest. And this is something that really pisses me off. Okay, maybe he was committing a minor felony, he was selling unlicensed cigarettes, he shouldn't have been doing that. But the issue here is the proportion. If that was the case, they could have given him a fine, booked him, something like that. In no way was what his minor felony did not correlate to being choked to death. There was no correlation and proportionality whatsoever. So if you're thinking, oh well, he deserves it, well, several questions. Would you be saying that if it was a white guy? I don't think you would. And frankly, I do think there is a racism issue here. We can't ignore that fact, because there is a disproportionate number of black men who are being killed by the police. Now, people might argue there is also a disproportionate number of black men involved in gangs, etc. But Eric Garner was not a violent gang member. This was not a case of a violent thug sort of threatening a police officer with a knife or a gun. This was a case of a man who was, okay, committing a minor felony, but showing no threat whatsoever. I would say look at the video, but his family have requested privacy. They go through their time of mourning. That's understandable. I just find it sickening that anyone would make excuses for this. Under the same logic, if that is your logic, then you would apply the same logic to white motorists who commit minor traffic offences. I don't see much difference. And I just find it baffling that anyone would make excuses for this, because what we have is the epitome of a police state, where these arrogant cops think that because they're wearing a uniform they can basically do what they want. And incidentally, this sort of logic that, oh well, the public are ungrateful, there's a side to that that they aren't saying, which is this. The public have to rely on the police. They've got no choice, because the public cannot take the law into their own hands. So basically I think they're using that as almost a form of blackmail, basically saying we can do whatever we want and you can't complain because we're protecting you. That's basically the logic that they're taking. So I don't think they have any comprehension of what is going on here. And basically I do blame good cops who maybe they are thinking, well, we don't deserve this criticism because we protect the public. But I would say, well, if you're that sort of police officer, you should be combating this problem from the inside. You should be condemning officers who abuse their position. It's not fair to blame the public and say that the public is ungrateful. The public has every right to be angry and concerned about what is going on, because the public are the victims of this problem. So I really have very little patience for the excuses that are being made. There's clear double standards when it comes to the application of the law. Now, why is it Officer Pantaleo was breaking the NYPD's own code of conduct? which clearly prohibited chokeholds. So why was he not disciplined on day one by the NYPD? I don't get that at all. Either he's very stupid, or the training procedures were not efficient. It's one or the other. I mean, this is no different than what happens in countries like Egypt or China, which the United States is very happy to lecture. So, like a lot of people, I'm very angry about this. And unfortunately people have been accusing CNN of stirring up lists. They may have been doing that in the Ferguson case, but on this occasion, I think it's right that they report on it. And I do think there is a racial element. We can't avoid that fact. Would Eric Garner be dead if he was a white man? I think the question really remains. Now, that's not to say that white Americans don't ever also suffer from police abusing their position, but there is a disproportionate number of black Americans who do. The point here is there is no proportionality. If he was selling unlicensed cigarettes, what is wrong with simply booking him, giving him a fine? That minor felony did not deserve to result in a man losing his life. They should have stopped the minute he was saying he can't breathe, but they didn't. That is why this was a killing. Well, they shouldn't have done it in the first place. And the fact that other officers were preventing people from filming it shows just how corrupt they are. And there's a very dangerous situation in America whereby police can pretty much do whatever they want. This is a very dangerous culture. Very dangerous. And whilst the problem is not as bad here, it is starting to go that way. There's plenty of police in the UK that think that when they're wearing a uniform they could do what they want, and it exists in other countries. I wouldn't say any country is perfect in this regard. But basically there needs to be a change in attitudes. And far too many Americans have a callous contempt for their fellow citizens. There is absolutely no valid excuses for what happened to Eric Garner. None. So I do believe that powerful people like Bill de Blasio, like President Obama, need to come out and say the police need to understand they are not above the law. And there needs to be, frankly, scrutiny of these grand juries. I don't know what the hell is wrong with them. If they saw that video and they still reach the same decision, I don't blame the family for saying that they are callous. I can't understand that. I just can't understand how they could have cleared this officer of any wrongdoing after watching that video. And the fact that there is a video is very important. It only goes to show that if there was no video, then all we would have is conjecture, and Eric Garner would be slandered. So, there's too many officers making excuses for this. There's too many members of the public making excuses for it. And there is a very dangerous mentality, both from the police and from other Americans, by saying, oh, he resisted arrest. How the hell can you condone someone losing their life because they were resisting arrest? And resisting arrest, how is that even defined? I just think it's very disturbing. And frankly, I feel anxious about ever travelling to the US, because I do not trust American police, based on these cases I'm hearing. And it is unfortunate for the good police, because they're going to be tarred with the same brush, but it is partly their own fault for not speaking up against it. So if you are a police officer who does think there is something wrong with this, I urge you, please, as a decent human being, you need to speak up against this. Don't condone it. Don't make excuses for this officer, because what happened was utterly, utterly reprehensible. And I think if the police are worried about losing public trust, their behaviour and their attitude is not helping. If they want to build hearts and minds, they need to come out and say, we don't condone this behaviour. But they're not going to do that, which to me indicates they're morally corrupt.